Hey Maria,
Hey Joshua, how are you?
doing good, doing good. Listen, everybody, we have a special guest here on the Dream Builders podcast, Maria Huntoon. Again, want to let y'all know first, the purpose of our podcast is to help buyers, sellers, agents, small businesses, and nonprofits connect with the resources and knowledge to achieving their goals. We have a special guest. We're talking about canine animal control, but not control, but consulting services. How do you build relationships with your pets? So we have Maria Huntoon, owner of Maria G. Huntoon Canine Consulting Services. She is the expert on how we can make our animal friends come together and have a family. So Maria, if I could ask you a quick question here is what inspires you to take a holistic approach to dog behavior and training?
Yeah, well, thanks again. Thanks so much, Joshua, for having me here. I'm very happy to be part of this program. And working with animals has always been natural to me. I've known from the time I was a kid, I just felt very connected to animals. I was the kid that was, the 5-year-old that was reading National Geographic World and trying to dig up dinosaur bones in my backyard, which were really probably just, some little rabbit bones or something, but I just always had a connection with animals. Any animals always gravitated towards me and felt very safe with me, and I just felt very safe with them. So it kind of made me just decide that's what I wanted to do with my life. I just didn't know in what capacity. And I actually started working, well, volunteering and then working at a vet in high school. Throughout my high school, I worked with our vet in town. I just thought being a veterinarian was the natural thing to do, if you want to work with animals. But when it come time for college, I was like, well, I can't really afford veterinary school. It's really expensive, and I didn't want to be in debt for 10 years, whatever. And so that was actually a blessing in disguise because I realized that I love the psychology of behavior more than I love traditional medicine anyway. I've always kind of felt very geared towards a holistic approach, which is like looking at the root of why things are happening the way they are, So why is an animal doing what it's doing? Why is an animal having the illness that it's having? Why what motivates these beings to do the things that they're doing, and how do we get them to work with us in a way that's harmonious as opposed to one that's a very forceful or one that's based out of fear. I didn't want to do that. I never felt that was a great way to have a relationship. So that's pretty much how I decided to be on this path. And I've been in this path now for 25 years. I trained guide dogs for the blind for 9 years professionally at a school in New York, which was a lot of fun, and I loved it. And we learned about dog and animal behavior from some of the top dog trainers and animal behaviorists in the world. Dr. Ian Dunbar, Ken Ramirez, Sarah Wilson, and Suzanne Clothier, and all of these people would come. We're the third largest guide dog school in the country. So a lot of, they really want to make sure we were at the top of our game when it came to dog behavior and what we were putting out there to help people with disabilities. And so I really learned so much. I loved it. And as much as I loved working in the service dog field, I just realized that there were so many dogs that end up every year euthanized or abandoned just because people don't understand them. Not necessarily because there's something wrong with the dog, but because there's an imbalance in the relationship between the dog and the person. Something's getting lost in translation, or there's an issue that may be a natural dog behavior, but the person doesn't like that behavior and they don't know how to get that to change. And so I decided that I couldn't work in the guide dog field and have my own behavior consulting business at the same time. It was just not going to work out time wise. So I left the guide dog field and started my own behavior consulting business in 2014. And yeah, I've been doing it ever since.
Awesome, awesome. And just go and dive into it, there's an old saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Is that saying too, like, what is, could you teach a dog that's old? Can you train it?
Yeah, that's a great question, Joshua, because I do get that question a lot. A lot of times when people have young puppies, they're like, oh, okay, it's easy to train them. And then they are 5 or 8 and they're like, okay, I think we're definitely past this prime, or sometimes even 2. They're like, hey, my dog's 2 years old. Is this too late? And my answer for that is generally no. An animal can learn at any age. Even a human, we're just primed at different points of our life for learning. So the analogy I often use with people is, how a 5-year-old can pick up a new language really quickly because their brain is just geared for learning at that age. They're like little sponges absorbing everything, right?
Yeah.
You can still teach a 50-year-old, they can still learn a new language too. It just takes a little more practice and habit forming and conditioning and learning, a little more effort.
Mm.
So the same thing is true with the dog. The longer a dog has gotten to practice a behavior, yeah, it's going to take a lot more time and effort and conditioning to undo that behavior and teach a new replacement behavior. But it is still possible in most circumstances. I mean, a dog is still going to be who a dog is. Like if a dog is naturally a more high strung dog, you can teach a dog how to modulate their arousal and to be able to settle and learn to be more calm. But it doesn't mean that they'll completely do a 180 and turn into okay, I'm just like a lazy bum dog that wants to sit on the couch. Like they may still have some level of just being a little more high strung because it's just who they are.
Mm.
They're just a little more active versus not active, or a little more easily affected by things in their environment than a dog who isn't at all, phased by those things. So you have a little bit of the balance between nature versus nurture going on, but in most cases, you can still teach a dog to build new behavior at any age.
For sure, for sure. And how do mental and emotional factors influence adult behavior? I know we talked about holistic approach, but how do you address them in training?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so my biggest kind of passion is educating people about how their dog works and why their dog's doing that. And one of the things that traditional trainers, this isn't meant to be this, a lot of traditional trainers focus on sit down, stay calm, like the obedience side of things, which is all really important. But I look at that as it's just one level of the equation. It's the tool that we have. Obedience, sit down, stay calm, that's the tool we have. But when we're trying to build behavior and we're dealing with things that have an emotional basis, things like anxiety, aggression, reactivity, fear, and also things that I consider side effect behaviors like having accidents in the house when it's not, the dog is normally potty trained and now all of a sudden it's peeing on your bed, where it's marking on the couch, or chewing things up, or digging in the yard, or barking incessantly. These are what I refer to as side effect behaviors because they have a root cause that's addressed to that emotional state. So if we don't address that emotional state and that arousal, the way the dog is feeling affects the dog's behavior, just like it affects us. We act differently if we're happy or if we're mad or if we're overtired, or if we're sad. And so, because dogs have all the same parts of their body and brain that regulate their emotional system that we humans have, that arousal works the same way.
Mm.
I mean, yes, there are also some big differences between dogs and humans, and we certainly have to understand those as well. But how that arousal works is the same. So, if we don't address what the dog's dealing with mentally and emotionally, like, are they overwhelmed? Are they stressed or anxious? Do we have to break lessons into smaller slices of criteria that your dog can get, and then they'll be able to learn and progress from there? Or, when they're out on a walk or they're out in town and they're feeling really overwhelmed, maybe their reactivity is because they're like, I don't know how to deal with this. It's just
Yeah,
too overstimulating. It's too much pressure. So that's what we have to be able to look at, and help keep the dog in a lower state of arousal so that they can learn, they can think, they can make better choices, and they can become conditioned to handle that situation differently.
for sure, for sure. And you are answering these questions as a professional. Again, the canine consulting service. This is where it's at, Maria Huntoon. So I have another question for you, Maria. What
Mhm.
are some common signs that a dog is struggling emotionally or mentally?
Yeah, so a lot of signs, like some are obvious, are very obvious. Like if a dog is barking and lunging and growling and biting people, then we know that there's an emotional imbalance there. But some things are a lot more subtle that some pet owners may not notice these things initially until it starts to become a bigger issue.
Mm.
So even things like like a dog just not being able to settle. They're pacing around a lot, or when they're laying down, they're panting a lot, as opposed to really being able to like relax and settle, or they're chewing on themselves or scratching themselves a lot, or they're avoiding performing certain behaviors like, no, I don't want to go out on a walk, or no, this thing is scary to me, so I'm pretending I don't even see it. When sometimes people will think the dog's just being stubborn and it isn't listening to them. Sometimes the dog's not listening because they're trying to avoid the situation the person's putting them in, or because their arousal level is just too high that they are past that threshold. They can't feel comfortable enough to think and process and learn. Um, some other things like just the way, like when a dog is being aggressive or reactive, stress is usually a very large underlying factor in those behaviors. Even aggression is very rarely a neurological like defect that a dog has. It's very often, I would say in more than 80% of aggression cases, it's stress based. The dog is stressed for some reason. They're like I was talking to somebody just a couple days ago where her dog always had a little bit of arousal to begin with and didn't really settle and was always kind of on edge. And now they brought another dog into the household, and this dog has never been the same since. Like this dog and the other dog just aren't getting along. And now this first dog's behaviors are getting worse.
Mm.
And it's a symptom of the stress that he's feeling by being forced to be in this living situation where he's not comfortable with it. There aren't clear enough boundaries for him to understand it well enough. And so that stress is creating a big tension between the two dogs, which then means they're getting into fights, and that creates tension for the whole family. Now the whole family's walking on eggshells and stress, and that becomes a vicious cycle, you know? So we have to address that dog's stress levels and that dog's arousal and help them feel more comfortable and confident. So, they may never really love and get along with that dog, but they're certainly not going to be able to just make it, oh, they'll figure it out eventually. At this point, there's no just figuring it out, unless we address the stress issues underlying that.
For sure, for sure. And when we talk about dogs, there's different type of breeds. So, is there different trainings or techniques, that you use more, is it the technique or is it the personality that you can help train these different breeds of dogs?
Yeah, that's a great question, Joshua, because yeah, different breeds of dogs, they certainly have different, obviously, every dog's an individual, right? So they all have their own little temperaments, but there are, certain breeds are prone to having certain temperament types because of what they're meant to do, like herding breeds and terriers. They tend to be a little more high arousal. They tend to be a little more strong-minded because of the jobs that these breeds are meant to do, right? So you have to really motivate them. They need different kinds of enrichment a lot of times in order to balance out that emotional state. Or if you have a really strong minded dog, like even a lot of the bully breeds, we look at them as like they're big, strong, tough dogs, and they're also very strong minded. So sometimes we think we have to dominate them in order to get them to respect us. And even though they're big, strong breeds, these breeds can be very emotionally sensitive. They're kind of like big babies in
Ah,
big dog muscle bodies. And so if we do things that are too aversive, we can actually exacerbate their behavior issues. So, yeah, there's different ways of dealing with different dogs where like when you have a strong-minded breed, I always tell my clients, you don't want to battle them in wits, because then you're just going to, okay, which one is stronger minded and one of you is going to lose. You don't want to risk that that's going to be you losing on that end. So you have to think about, especially when it comes to something like aggression, because dogs have the teeth and they can hurt you, right? So you really have to know, okay, what is this dog's motivation and how can I hate to use this term, like, how can I manipulate the dog into thinking that what I want them to do is in their best interest,
mhm.
But when you're playing with their motivation and now you're not forcing them to do something, you're setting parameters on the situation, you're giving them a chance to have some agency and autonomy within those parameters to make their own choices. But
Yeah.
because you're controlling the parameters, you're pretty much helping them make the choice you want them to make. And then when they make that choice and they feel good about making that choice, they're going to want to do that more often. So that can often be a lot more of effective way of working with those strong-minded breeds than just forcing them into something and being like, do this because I said so. And then they're in their strong-minded head going to say, but why? Why should I listen to you? What's in it for me? You know?
Sure.
So
Sure.
yeah. So yeah, definitely different breeds. They just have different, not to say there aren't exceptions. Like, yes, I have met the occasional lazy border collie, but most border collies are a lot more high arousal, high strung. They need a lot of enrichment and mental stimulation because they're a very active herding breed and they like to have a job to do. And in the absence of that, or knowing what their job is, even if they're not actively herding cattle or sheep, they still may need to feel like they have jobs. So it's about meeting those needs, regardless of what the dog's breed is. When we have a certain temperament type and they have certain needs, we have to make sure we're meeting those needs to find balance. And that's where, yes, some temperament types are going to have different needs than other temperament types.
For sure. And just as humans, we see that, if we put the right things in us, we can be more productive. Does this really happens for dogs? Like, what ingredients for homeowners like out there should they use
Mm-hmm.
to avoid hurting the dog or making the dog better and being able to train them to get them to do what we want them to do? I don't want a
Mm-hmm.
dog, I feel like, AI, right? The AI dog. I don't want a dog to just have his mind on its own, but I really want to be able to put the right nutrition in mine. I have
Mm-hmm.
two dogs, by the way, in my dog. So what are the key ingredients that dogs are looking for?
That's a great question too, because nutrition definitely affects behavior. And I've been in the behavior field for 25 years, but the past 9 years, I've always known nutrition affects behavior, but the past 9 years, I've really delved into studying a lot more about nutrition and gaining my certification as a dog nutritionist because it does affect behavior so much, but also it affects, even if a dog doesn't have behavior issues, it affects their quality of life, it affects their lifespan, it affects the way that are they happy or not every day. Especially when it comes to something like allergies. If your dog is itchy and having allergic reactions all the time, and most of their immune system is based in the gut, and they're not getting proper nutrition, then we're just accidentally, the problem just keeps persisting. So yeah, I mean, especially again, this depends on the dog. Every dog is a little different. So specific needs for each dog can be a little different based on what they're doing. But especially when I'm dealing with dogs that are anxious or reactive, I'm always looking at the nutrition because sometimes we don't feed dogs the most biologically appropriate diet. We feed them something that's really convenient to us, but isn't really what their bodies can utilize effectively. So, for example, dogs, the way their bodies are built, they're what we call facultative carnivores, which means they are meant to eat meat. Okay, yes, they have evolved through domestication. They can handle some carbohydrates, but mostly biologically, the only carbs that they need are for fiber, so that they can go to the bathroom. They don't need refined starches and sugars. And we tend to feed them a lot of those in the form of processed kibbles or treats that have a lot of flours and grains and legumes and potatoes and peas and all these other things. And those are things that can negatively affect our dog if they're having too many of those things, especially if they're already prone to having some anxiety or reactivity or aggression. That kind of, it's almost like, for lack of a better analogy, giving a child that has ADHD a lot of refined sugar. Not going to help their body function better. It's actually going to exacerbate their problem. So yeah, I do tend to recommend, I mean, for all clients, anybody who wants to have a healthier dog, I definitely recommend having as minimally processed of a diet as possible. And we can rate, there's a whole scale. I could talk about nutrition for hours, so we won't go so far into it, but
Yeah.
there is a whole scale where we go from processed to the most whole food form, and processed in the sense of how much processing a food goes through. Kibble goes through so much processing. So kibble is the most processed form of dog food. Whereas then you have completely the opposite side of the spectrum where you have a raw food diet where basically nothing is processed. It's all in its raw form, whole food form.
Hmm.
Okay. But then there's a lot of things in between where it doesn't have to be all or nothing. Sometimes, yes, kibble is the most convenient thing, but we also know it's maybe not the healthiest, just like it may be really convenient to go to McDonald's all the time because there's one on every corner, or Starbucks, or Chick-fil-A or something like that. But that doesn't mean, like, as humans, we know that eating processed food all the time isn't really healthiest for us. And just like when we're raising our kids, yeah, an ice cream or cookies here or there isn't so bad, but if they don't eat their fruits and their veggies and make sure they have their calcium and everything else, then they're also not going to grow strong or healthy, right? So the same is true with our dogs. And like I said, especially, it's even more important when we're dealing with behavior imbalances, because if the wrong raw materials in terms of the ingredients are going into your dog and your dog's body can't process those efficiently, then it creates a disconnect in how the body is working. And so especially when we're dealing with that arousal level, a lot of extra carbohydrates can exacerbate that arousal level. Yeah.
Mm.
And then there's kind of a whole additional side where even different foods. So this is based on traditional Chinese medicine, okay, which is an Eastern therapies that have been around for centuries. And this comes to food therapy and how different foods, different like ingredients have different effects on the body. So some are cooling, some are neutral, some are warming. And so we also want to make sure that we're feeding our dog the right types of food for their constitution. So for example, when we have a dog who has a lot of anxiety or aggression and they're running at a very high frequency, they're very hot, they're on fire like a lot of the time, we don't want them to be eating warming foods that are just fueling the fire more. So like chicken, for example, that is a very warming protein. You can find a lot of kibbles that are chicken and rice, and those are, that can be a not very good mix for a dog who's dealing with any of those high running behaviors. Again, anxiety, reactivity, even fear, or even allergies. If your dog's having a lot of allergies or skin issues, feeding them warming foods are actually pro-inflammatory. It's just accidentally continuing to keep the body in an inflammatory state, as opposed to helping cool it down and bring it to a more even keeled level.
For sure, for sure. Wow, wow, wow. So, because I was going to ask you about, the difference between raw kibble and homemade diet, but you completely answered that from just that one statement. We know you've been doing it for 25 years. We know that you're a dog enthusiast, but can you share us a successful story of a dog whose behavior dramatically improved through your methods?
Yeah, yeah. I'll give you an example of one that was just a couple weeks ago. So I have a client, and she was actually referred to me from a mentee that I had. I'm a mentor for two of the dog training academies around. So when they have local students who are trying to get certified to be dog trainers, they have them shadow me as part of their curriculum. So I had this mentee who is now off on her own doing some dog training, and she contacted me with a client who really needed some help with the dog's fear issues. So this dog um, was a few years old, and it was a Spanish Galga, which is a working greyhound from Spain. They actually rescued her from Spain. And because she was used for breeding in this working line of dogs, she was very fearful. She hadn't had a lot of exposure to the outside world or to new people. It was really only the people in her kennel that were caring for her. She had a very limited, and unfortunately, a lot of these dogs they don't have the best lives. Okay. And so when they rescued this dog and they brought her into their home a couple months ago, at first she was like really nervous and timid and like wouldn't say boo to anybody. And then once she started getting more comfortable, she got very defensive with people coming into her house. She would bark at them nonstop, and she couldn't settle because she was like, I don't know you people. Why are you in my house? Like, I need to protect my space. And it was worrying, of course, to the owners because they wanted to make sure their dog didn't bite somebody. She was obviously reacting to people coming in the house for a reason, but they didn't know what to do differently to help her. So my mentee had suggested contact Maria. She's going to be able to help you with these things. So I came in, I met with the couple and their dog. Um, and it only took 2 sessions for them to learn a lot more, to understand their dog and what she needed when it came to the support of how to set up people coming into the house, how to help her make a more positive association with that, how to keep her arousal level lower, and how to help her work out any of her anxiety and stress. And after our second session, they actually sent me a picture of her. They were able to have a couple come over for dinner, and the dog was able to just lay on her dog bed, chew away on her little cow ear. She calmed down within a matter of a couple of minutes of them coming into the house, which is something that prior to those two sessions, she couldn't do. The people would be over for an hour and she would just be barking at them nonstop for that entire hour. Like she never got comfortable with them and never settled in. So, that I like to use that as an example because it just shows that when we have a better understanding of our dog and the tools that they need, the tools we have to use that can help them, we can give them the things that they need to understand how to do things differently. It can really make a big difference. So in this case, it only took the two sessions for the people to understand how to help the dog, and they were already in a matter of a couple of weeks seeing such a big difference.
For sure. And that is awesome. And I think, and that to my understanding is, I believe if you can elaborate more on what is the most rewarding part of your job. To me, what I'm getting is really having that intimacy with the dog and understanding and helping the owner say, hey, you have to understand your dog like a person, kind of, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, that is definitely, yeah,
Yeah, they
that's
have a
definitely
they have their own minds, but you have to understand them to the point where it's like a telepathic communication where you and your dog can understand the guidelines on, hey, this is how I expect you to act. And just like a child, you raising them up and everything that you need to do. So if you could, what is the most rewarding part of your work? Can you elaborate on that?
yeah, yeah, that is definitely it. When I meet with people and I see them just go, huh, this makes so much sense. This is how I can have a better relationship with my dog and then work on these things in a better way, because I do use, even though, like I said, some similarities between dogs and humans and some big differences, but I do use a lot of, there are a lot of parallels. So I do use a lot of analogies when I talk to clients. And, when we're trying to understand our dog, kind of like you, so you said the word, like it's about how when you said like a telepathic, it's a connection. You have to be connected with your dog. You have to understand your dog and have that relationship with your dog in the same way you learn to have a relationship with a spouse or a sibling or a friend. Like in order to make any relationship work and be harmonious, you have to know what are their preferences, how do they work, what do they like, what do they not like, what buttons do I push when I want to piss them off? What gifts do I get when I want to make them happy?
Uh,
Like these things, you build that trust and that respect, and that's what keeps a relationship thriving, right? And so the same is true with our dogs. When we can really understand what makes them tick, what is their motivation, what are the things that they like to do versus what are the things that they really just don't like to do, like we can have a lot better balance. I've had some clients where sometimes the reason that their dog is freaking out when they take them into public is because they're taking their dog into something that their dog's trying to say, I don't want to do this. I don't want to go to the farmer's market on a Saturday morning down at Forsyth Park where it's so packed and crazy and there's so much stimulation and I can't think straight. It's too overwhelming for me. So there are some dogs that can handle that just fine. But if your dog, yes, there are ways that you can help your dog get more comfortable at dealing with those things if your dog wants to learn to do that and they just don't know how. Okay. But there are some dogs that are just never going to want to do that. Just like there are some people, you have introverts, you have extroverts, right? There are some people that are never going to be comfortable going into a mixer with 100 people that they don't know.
Sure.
That's going to be very overwhelming for that person. They're not going to have a good time. They're going to be like, when can I get the heck out of here? Where then you have people who can go into that situation and by the end of the night they have 20 new friends. They're happy, they're comfortable doing that. And so it is the same thing with our dogs. Like we have to respect and understand who they are. We can't make them into something that they're not. We can help them bring out the best version of themselves, but I was never going to be a brain surgeon. If that's what my parents wanted me to do and they pushed me to do that, they would be severely disappointed. I would be miserable. I mean, I don't want to work and operate on people's brains every day. I don't need to
Yeah.
see that, you know. And that's too much stress for me holding life and death in my hands every day. So,
Yeah.
we do have to learn to understand and respect our dogs in that way. And like I said, we can help them bring out their best behavior. Sometimes they just don't know how to handle those situations, but sometimes there is also a line where they're like, this, your dog isn't meant to do this. Your dog doesn't want to do this. So if you keep forcing them to do this, you're going to keep having an issue on your hands because they're trying to tell you, I'm not okay with this.
Yeah, yeah, I completely understand that and agree. And before this time runs out, if someone was looking to work in the dog behavior and training field, what advice would you give them? I mean, you've been doing it for so well, really have a lot of knowledge. What advice would you give them?
So, a couple of things. The first thing I would say is keep learning. Like there's always so many studies that are being done and so much information coming out about how dogs work and why they do what they do. So, like, I love learning. I'm always taking seminars and webinars and reading books and taking classes to continue with my certification and also just to make sure that I'm at the top of my field in terms of what's going on in the field. But for someone who's just getting started, just be open to learning. There's a lot of information out there, but go through trusted sources to get it because there can also be a lot of misinformation out there. So look into certification councils, dog training certification councils. Look into Association for Professional Dog Trainers. Look into the Pet Professional Guild. These are organizations that really focus on the right kind of relationship-based training and understanding how dogs work and how to train them in a cohesive and harmonious way.
For sure, for sure. Well, thank you
And
so
get
much.
hands-on practice. Work with as many dogs as you can
Uh,
because then
yeah,
you get to really know all the differences and the nuances between them.
for sure. And I love that you are so in love with dogs. I even had know that you have a dog yourself, Sheba.
Yes, Shiba. Yep. Yep. And
Awesome.
before Sheba, I had my corgi Scout, and he was my little doggy soulmate. In fact, it was a joke with my husband. I had Scout before I had my husband. So my husband joked he always knew he was number two in my life, and Scout was number one.
That's awesome. That's awesome. But before, we got to go ahead and wrap this thing up. Just got one last question. How can the people get in touch with you? And for any dog owner out there, what's one piece of advice you will leave them with?
Yeah, so you can certainly reach out to me on my website, which is mghk9consulting.com. You can call me. My direct line is 845-549-0896. Or you could email me at maria@mghk9consulting.com. That word K9 is spelled out. It's not like the letter K and number nine. Um, and yeah, the best advice that I would give is listen to your dog. Sometimes you may need some help understanding what they're saying, but when you listen to your dog, you can really know to take the steps to have a more harmonious relationship with them.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Maria Huntoon, with owner of Maria G. Huntoon Canine Consulting Services. This podcast is sponsored by Page Properties Team, The Dream ENT, Real Estate for a Reason, and Make Real Estate Fun Again. A shout out to KGCI Real Estate on Air for collaborating with the Dream Builders podcast. We thank y'all so much for just spending a few minutes with us learning about how dog owners can be better trainers. And if we need assistance, Maria is the go-to canine trainer out here in Savannah, Georgia. Thank y'all so much. I hope you have a wonderful day, a fantastic week, and I catch y'all on the next episode. Be blessed and be safe. Peace.
Thank you guys.